Recently heard a story about somebody who works at an airport counter, and their job is to handle complaints from passengers who've missed their flights or whose flights have been delayed. And one day, sick of hearing constant abuse, they looked over at the wheelchairs that are used to assist passengers sometimes and decided to wheel one behind their counter and sit in it for a day just to see what would happen. And the angry abuse would soon trail off into politeness when people realised that they were speaking to someone in a wheelchair. And as far as I know, to this day, that person still sits in a wheelchair every day at work. You see, we like to categorise people, and we think and feel differently about those different categories. You know, it might be indifference or love or hate or fear or sympathy or empathy, but that's our natural behaviour. Now, when we think about ideas that change the world, we tend to think first of technology. We think of the wheel or electricity or the microchip. And these are absolutely ideas that have changed the world. But ultimately, these are tools, and it's how they're used that will make the biggest difference to the world around us. Let's look at what's broken in the world around us. We see injustice, we see inequality, we see violence and conflict, we see poverty. And all of these things are as a result of prejudice. And that's why I propose that the greatest challenge of our time is not actually better technology. I propose that the greatest challenge of our time is defeating prejudice in all its forms. Now, prejudice means basically to prejudge. It's to judge without evidence. And you wouldn't be a very good judge if you were to make a judgment without looking at the evidence. So a part of that, and what leads to prejudice, is ignorance. I know that you and I wouldn't make a big decision about something without looking at the facts first, would we? Well, let's look at a recent example. The question was asked, is the world getting better? Now, it's a simple, straightforward question. 3% of us, only 3% of us in Australia said yes. There's 4% in the UK, 6% in the US. Now, let's look at the data. So this is the worldwide trends from about 1980 to 2015 as a percentage of worldwide population of people in extreme poverty and people with access to basic education. Now, these graphs indicate that absolutely the world is getting better. And these are representative of several other areas as well, like famines, deaths by famines, the level of immunisation against infectious disease in developing countries, etc. The list goes on. The fact is that the world absolutely is getting better. Now, I watched 9/11 unfold on live TV, and it had a profound effect on me. And on that day, it changed the way that I thought and felt about Muslims. In America today, people's second greatest fear is of a terrorist attack. Now, we're going to look at some more data. But before I do, I just want to say that one person killed in a terrorist attack is one too many. Just like one person in extreme poverty or one person without access to basic education is one too many. So there's absolutely a lot of work for us to do. And the world absolutely needs ideas to change these things. But let's look at the data. So this is 46,000 dots on a page, and I've enlarged a portion of that just to give you a sense of scale. But in your lifetime in the United States, the chances of being killed in a refugee terrorist attack is not 1 in 46,000. It's 1 in 46 million. Now that would mean that there would need to be 1,000 of these pages to represent those odds. Now let's look at some other statistics as a point of reference in comparison to that. You are 6 times more likely to be killed by a shark in America than by a refugee terrorist attack. And I'd say if that guy's about to jump in the water, his chances are probably a lot higher again. You are 407,000 times more likely to be killed in a car accident. And if you drive a convertible, don't wear a seatbelt, your chances are probably much higher again. But let's look at the statement. Your second greatest fear is something that has a 1 in 46 million chance of happening in your lifetime. It seems crazy, doesn't it? 2 years after 9/11 happened, my wife and I went to Thailand and we taught Muslim uni students English for several months. And my perception and my category of Muslims was completely shattered, because the people that I was spending time with were far more like me than like somebody capable of carrying out a terrorist attack. You see, in our popular culture, we have the evil villain, and they're one-dimensional, and, they're evil personified. It brings out the fanatic in us because we want justice to be done. We want nothing more than for them to be destroyed, and when they are, we cheer. And we're constantly getting this message through our TV shows and our movies, just like we're constantly getting negative media that's telling us the world's getting worse. Those stats that we saw earlier about worldwide poverty and disease, things might be actually happening less but being reported more. And so we're constantly getting these messages through media, through news, that are colouring and affecting our perceptions. I grew up in a home without a TV. And while that made me the weird kid at school, I'm actually grateful now because it meant that I read a lot. And studies show that children that are exposed to reading, read to and read themselves, develop more empathy compared to children who watch lots of TV, who actually develop less. Neuroscientists would say that at a neurobiological level, reading about an experience causes the same brain activity, the same brain patterns to take place as when you're actually experiencing that situation in real life. The Egyptian writer and activist Ala al-Aswani, who also happens to be a Muslim, writes that a fanatic cannot love literature. Why? Because when you read a great novel and you're inside that character's head, you're no longer thinking about their nationality, you're not thinking about their race or their beliefs or the colour of their skin. You're only thinking about the human being. And so he argues that reading great novels absolutely can make us better human beings. So I'm going to propose a few things that we can do to explore ideas to change the world. And the first one is to question courageously. Now, why courageously? Because they're questions that might make us uncomfortable. They're questions that might make people around us uncomfortable. Because I think deep down we have a sense of what prejudices we already hold. So let's begin by asking courageous questions. Let's investigate courageously. We've already seen how a simple perception can be completely shattered by looking at the data, and we have more data at our fingertips than we ever have had before. So let's look at the data. What are our perceptions based on? What are our prejudices based on? What's the data say? Read courageously. And by that I mean don't just read books about people like you and by people like you, but find autobiographies by people who think differently to you, who believe differently to you, who are in a different environment to you that will challenge your thinking. And finally, and this is the most important thing that I want to say today, and that's listen courageously. Now, it wasn't until we actually went and spent time with Muslim people and heard their stories that our perceptions were changed. But I want to give you another example. This is Chanti, and he took us to a remote part of Cambodia to show us temples that tourists usually never get to see. And when we were there, he noticed on the ground something, and he picked it up, and it was a mortar shell. It's like a propelled grenade. And he told us a story. He said that when he was a small boy, him and a friend of his were playing in a field not unlike this one, and they noticed one of these on the ground, and not knowing what it was, he leant down and picked it up, and they began to play catch with it. He threw it to his friend, and his friend threw it back to him, and he threw it to his friend, and it hit the ground, and it exploded, and it killed him. Now, I'd questioned why Cambodia is the way it is today. I'd looked at the data, I knew the statistics, I knew the history, I knew the conflict. I'd even read some powerful autobiographies of survivors who'd been through the genocide. But nothing hit me like that moment. Erin Morgenstern talks about telling a tale that takes up residence in your soul, that becomes your blood and purpose. And who knows what you might do because of that tale. It becomes your gift to give to the world. And see, when Chanti told me that story, it took up residence in my soul, just like many other stories that I heard face to face from Cambodian people. You see, I just saw myself with a young friend of mine as a young boy walking in a field and finding something on the ground, and I saw myself reach down and pick it up and throw it to my friend. And it suddenly got really real for me. It's stories like these. See, there's prejudices that cause that grenade to be sitting there in that field, and there's prejudices that exist today around the world that cause this same kind of scenario to play out. It's hearing stories like Shanti's and many other stories from Cambodians that inspired my wife and I to start an organisation in Cambodia called Milk and Honey that works to empower Cambodians to make a difference in their own country. So can a story really defeat prejudice? Well, let's look at a really challenging example. This is the Israeli-Palestinian border, and this is a young Palestinian boy, and he's looking at an Israeli soldier. Now, for many boys his age, the only Israeli they might have ever seen would be a soldier. And this has been called the intractable conflict. Lots of people have tried to bring peace to this conflict that's raged on for over 100 years. Many lives have been lost, and there's been no peace. One day, a young Israeli woman named Natalia picked up the phone to call a Jewish friend of hers, and she accidentally dialed the wrong number, and a Palestinian man answered the phone. Now, instead of just hanging up straight away, she decided to listen courageously, and she had a conversation with him. He told her how their food that they had access to was rotting, and how he was concerned about his pregnant wife, that he wouldn't be able to get her to a hospital to give birth. And as a result of that conversation, that young woman started an organisation called the Parents Circle. And I love that name because what better reason is there for us to defeat prejudice than for the world that our children will inherit? They started an initiative called the Hello Peace phone line. And basically a Palestinian person could call an Israeli person for 30 minutes for free or vice versa. And in the first 5 years of opening that phone line, they had over 1 million conversations take place. Now, sure, many of them would be yelling matches and very emotional, but there were many long and lasting friendships that were made between Israelis and Palestinians as a result. There's a young boy named Ali, a young Palestinian boy, and he has diabetes. Probably not unlike a boy that we see pictured. One of those conversations were between his parents and an Israeli family. And that Israeli family now brings life-saving insulin to the border regularly for Ali. So ask Ali, can a story really defeat prejudice? Can a story really change the world? And so there's stories there to be told. And so my challenge to you today is not to go looking for ideas to change the world. Go looking for stories, and the ideas will come. There's a time to look at the data, to question, to investigate, to read. But then let's turn off our devices, let's turn off the news, turn off our TVs, close our books, and go across the street or go across the world and get face to face with people who are unlike us. Listen to their stories. And as those stories are told, you then have a responsibility to tell them to the world. And when you do, you put yourself into those stories and you make them available to a whole new audience. There's nothing more powerful than a story told face to face like we're learning today. Brené Brown said, if we deny our stories, they define us. But if we own our stories, we get to write a brave new ending. Thank you very much.